The autumn morning was cold and gray, matching the emotional landscape of everyone involved in the case that was about to unfold. 7-year-old Emma Richardson sat in the backseat of her mother's silver Civic, her small fingers pressed against the cold window glass as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot. The drive from their apartment had taken 30 minutes, though it felt like hours. Her mother had been unusually quiet, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles that turned her fingers a frightening shade of pale. Emma had noticed her mother's hands shaking slightly as shifted gears and navigated through traffic with unusual aggression, honking at other drivers and muttering complaints under her breath. Richardson had once been a vibrant, joyful woman. Photos from her wedding day showed a woman with genuine smile lines around her eyes, someone who laughed freely and loved openly. But that version of had slowly disappeared over the past 2 years, replaced by someone harder, more brittle, someone who seemed to carry an invisible weight on her shoulders at all times. The divorce from Emma's father, David, had not been a quick, civilized separation. Instead, it had evolved into a brutal, prolonged war, the kind of battle where both parties seemed determined to hurt the other, regardless of the collateral damage left in their wake. Emma was the collateral damage, though neither parent seemed fully aware of the extent of the harm they were causing. Emma clutched a small stuffed dog to her chest, a gift from her paternal grandmother that her mother had reluctantly allowed her to keep. The toy was worn from constant holding, its brown fur matted in places, one eye slightly loose. Emma often held it when she felt scared or confused, which had become increasingly frequent over the past months. At 7 years old, Emma was already developing the premature emotional sophistication that comes from being caught between two warring parents. She understood at some level that a 7-year-old should never have to understand, that today was important. Today would determine her future. Today would decide where she would live, whom she would see, and how her life would unfold. Desperation to retain full custody had become almost all-consuming. She'd hired an expensive attorney, Marshall Finch, a man with a reputation for aggressive tactics and a winning record. She'd spent thousands of dollars on legal fees, money that her modest income as a dental hygienist could barely support. She prepared extensively for this day, creating detailed notebooks documenting David's supposed failures as a father, his absence during important moments, his irresponsibility. She'd even recruited her sister to testify about David's alleged drinking problem, though truthfully, Sister had only seen him drink more than 2 beers perhaps twice in their entire acquaintance. Moore had been extensively coaching Emma on what to say in court. "Just remember what we talked about," had whispered to Emma during breakfast that morning, her voice taking on that particular tone that made Emma's stomach feel tight and anxious. "Remember how Daddy was always working and never had time for you. Remember how he forgot your birthday that one time when you were 5. Emma did remember that incident. Her father had been working out of state on an important project and had mistakenly thought her birthday was the following weekend. He'd sent an elaborate apology with flowers and a make-up celebration when he returned. But constant reminders had reframed that single mistake into a narrative of paternal negligence and indifference. As they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, took a moment to compose herself. She checked her reflection in the mirror, smoothing her hair and adjusting her blazer. She'd chosen professional attire carefully, wanting to appear put together and stable in front of the judge. Had spent the previous evening researching Judge, reading about his reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who valued stability and traditional family structures. She'd even discussed with her attorney what kinds of answers would most appeal to his judicial philosophy. Emma, meanwhile, felt physically ill. Her small chest felt tight, and she'd barely eaten the toast her mother had offered for breakfast. She wasn't entirely sure what was going to happen in the courtroom, despite her mother's attempts to explain. What she did understand, with the clarity that sometimes comes to perceptive children, was that her mother was extremely worried about something, and that worry somehow involved Emma's father. She also understood that whatever happened today would be significant, that her mother's tension, her careful coaching, her insistence that Emma stick to the story, all pointed to something momentous. Took Emma's hand as they walked toward the courthouse steps. Her grip was firm, almost painful in its intensity. Emma's small hand felt dwarfed by her mother's larger one. As they climbed the stone steps, Emma noticed other people also entering the building, some looking equally stressed, others appearing more calm and professional. A man in a suit hurried past them, and Emma's heart jumped, wondering if it was her father. It wasn't. David had entered through a different entrance, arriving separately with his own attorney, a younger woman named Sandra who had recommended a different approach to the proceedings. Inside the courthouse hallway, while they waited for the hearing to begin, bent down to Emma's level. Her face was close to Emma's, her breath slightly rushed. "Emma, sweetheart, this is very important. You need to be brave today. You need to remember that you love Mommy best, right? And that you want to stay with Mommy." Emma nodded, though she felt a confusing swirl of emotions. She loved her mother, certainly, but she also loved her father deeply. The question itself felt impossible to answer honestly without hurting one of them. Continued, her voice urgent and low. "And if they ask you about Daddy, you remember what we talked about, okay? How he's always working and doesn't have time for you. How he forgot your birthday." Emma nodded again, mechanically, sensing her mother's desperation and wanting to please her, wanting to ease the worry etched so deeply into her mother's face. What neither Emma nor fully recognized was that Emma's anxiety was skyrocketing. The pressure to choose sides, the implicit message that loving her father equally would somehow betray her mother, the coaching and prompting about what to say, all of it was creating psychological damage that would take months or years to repair. Emma was being positioned as a pawn in her parents' battle, and the weight of that position was crushing her in subtle but profound ways. As a bailiff called them to enter the courtroom, squeezed Emma's hand one final time. "Just remember, sweetheart, Mommy loves you so much. And today you're going to help Mommy, right?" Emma managed a small nod, though internally she felt as though her 7-year-old heart might shatter from the impossible position she'd been placed in. As they walked through the courtroom doors toward their table, Emma had no idea that this day would become a turning point. Not because her mother's carefully constructed strategy would succeed, but because forces far beyond anyone's control were about to intervene in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The courtroom was a study in austere grandeur and intimidating formality. Everything about the space had been deliberately designed to inspire a sense of solemnity and authority. High ceilings soared above, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere that made even voices sound smaller and less certain than they did elsewhere. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany that had been polished to a deep shine, reflecting the light from the fluorescent fixtures overhead in muted glimmers. The floor was a pattern of black and white marble tiles, laid out in a geometric design that seemed to pull the eye toward the front of the courtroom, where Judge sat in his elevated chair, positioned like a secular deity presiding over the disputes of mortals below. Judge was a man of 63 years, with silver hair that had turned completely white over his decades on the bench. His face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent a lifetime absorbing other people's trauma, anger, and desperation. Deep lines ran from his nose to the corners of his mouth, lines etched by years of frowning over legal documents and the complicated human situations they represented. His eyes, however, were his most striking feature. They were a pale blue-gray, observant and penetrating, capable of seeming both infinitely weary and acutely aware simultaneously. Judge had presided over more than 400 custody cases during his 28 years on the bench. He'd witnessed every possible variation of human behavior: the bitter ex-spouse, the desperate parent, the alienated child, the concerned grandparent. He thought he'd seen everything the family court system had to offer. What Judge had come to understand over the course of nearly 3 decades was that custody cases were rarely actually about the law. They were about pain, deep, visceral pain that had metastasized into anger, resentment, and a desperate need to punish the other party. The law provided the battlefield, but the real fight was emotional and psychological. Children caught in the middle of these battles became collateral damage, whether their parents acknowledged it or not. Judge had become increasingly cynical about his role in these proceedings, recognizing that no matter what decision he made, someone would be hurt, and the child would likely suffer most of all. This particular case, Richardson v. Richardson, had arrived on his docket 3 months earlier. He'd reviewed the preliminary documents with his usual careful attention. His attorney had filed extensive documentation, complete with photographs of David's apartment, receipts showing his work travel schedule, and character affidavits from his family members. David's attorney had filed her own documentation, school records showing Emma doing well when she was with him, testimony from his employer about his reliable work performance, letters from friends attesting to his quality as a father. It was the standard custody battle ballet, each side presenting their version of reality, each convinced that their narrative was the objective truth. Judge settled into his leather chair, which creaked slightly under his weight. He had a ritual he performed before every custody case began. He closed his eyes for a moment and reminded himself that behind all the legal arguments, all the documentation, all the attorney posturing, was a human being. In this case, a very small human being, whose entire future was about to be influenced by decisions made in this room. He'd learned long ago that this moment of centering himself was essential to maintaining his humanity in a system that often threatened to strip it away. The gallery behind the bar that separated the judicial proceedings from public observation was moderately full. There were the standard courthouse regulars, law students taking notes, court observers interested in family law, a few journalists hopping for a compelling story. Custody cases were rarely newsworthy unless they involved celebrities or particularly egregious circumstances. This one seemed routine on the surface. There was also a woman Judge recognized as sister, there to provide moral support. On David's side, an older woman, likely his mother, Emma's paternal grandmother, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression anxious. Sat at the plaintiff's table on the left side of the courtroom, beside her attorney, Marshall Finch. Finch was a man in his mid-50s with the polished appearance of someone accustomed to winning. He wore an expensive suit, Italian shoes, and had the kind of confidence that came from years of courtroom success. He was reviewing documents with whispering instructions into her ear. Sat rigidly, her posture perfect, her facial expression carefully arranged into one of concerned but composed motherhood. She dressed in a navy blazer and modest jewelry, every detail calculated to present a specific image to Judge. Across the courtroom sat David Richardson at the defendant's table with his attorney, Sandra. Sandra was younger than Marshall, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and an air of careful preparation. She'd only entered family law 5 years earlier, transitioning from corporate law, which meant she came to custody battles without the burnout that sometimes affected more established practitioners. She genuinely believed in David's case, had spent hours reviewing documents, and had carefully prepared strategy that differed significantly from the aggressive posturing that Marshall Finch favored. David sat with his shoulders slightly slumped, the weight of the proceeding visible on his face. He was a handsome man of 41, with dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples and hands that bore the calluses of someone who did physical work. He was a project manager for a construction company, which explained the travel schedule that had emphasized in her documentation. What's narrative had conveniently omitted was that David worked construction management so that he could support his family and provide stability. He also made reasonable income for his industry and was never financially delinquent in his child support obligations. Judge surveyed the room, taking in the entire tableau before him. This was the moment he always found most revealing, the moment before the proceedings actually began, when people's true emotional states were visible before they had time to compose themselves for the judge's benefit. He saw anxiety barely contained beneath her composed exterior. He saw David's resignation, as though he'd already decided the case would go against him. He saw the attorneys, one confident in his narrative, one carefully strategic but less flamboyant. Then Emma was brought in, and Judge's heart sank slightly. The child looked small and frightened, her hand held firmly by a bailiff. She was dressed in a white dress with small flowers, clearly chosen by her mother to present a certain image, the innocent child dressed like a porcelain doll. Emma's eyes were wide, taking in every detail of the courtroom with the heightened awareness of a child who senses that something significant is occurring around her. Judge took a moment to study this child who represented the center of this entire proceeding. Emma Richardson was 7 years old. She had her mother's delicate features but her father's darker coloring. She was already demonstrating the self-consciousness that comes from being the subject of intense adult attention and dispute. Judge recognized the signs of a child under psychological pressure, the slight tremor in her hand, the way her eyes darted between her parents, the tension in her small shoulders. He began to speak, explaining the procedures to Emma in language he'd carefully developed over his years on the bench, attempting to communicate with a 7-year-old while ensuring that the legal record was properly established. As he spoke, Judge wondered, as he always did in these cases, what would be best for this child. He wondered if the law as it was constituted was actually equipped to determine such matters. And he wondered if there was something he was missing, some crucial piece of information that would make the right decision obvious. What he didn't know, as he prepared to begin the testimony, was that the answer to his wondering was already present in the courtroom, simply waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The oath was administered with the kind of ceremonial gravity that the law required, even for children. Emma's small hand was placed on the Bible by the court clerk, and Judge asked her to promise to tell the truth. Emma, not fully understanding the gravity or implications of what she was promising, nodded solemnly and sat in the witness stand, which had been adjusted to a height more appropriate for a 7-year-old, though she still looked impossibly small sitting there. The courtroom fell into a profound silence, the kind of silence that happens when everyone present recognizes that something important is about to unfold. Attorney Marshall Finch approached the witness stand with a practiced smile that was designed to put Emma at ease. He'd done this countless times before, questioned children in custody cases with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his aggressive approach with adult witnesses. Marshall understood the psychology of courtroom perception. If he appeared kind and gentle with this child, the judge would associate his client with those same qualities. "Hello, Emma," Marshall said warmly. "I'm Mr. Finch. Your mommy asked me to ask you some questions today. That's okay, right?" Emma nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. Her eyes darted toward her mother, seeking reassurance, finding it in its encouraging nod. "Emma, can you tell me where you live?" Marshall began with easy, non-threatening questions. This was standard procedure, establishing comfort before moving toward more substantive questions. "I live with Mommy in our apartment," Emma answered, her voice small but clear. "It's on Maple Street. I have my own room with purple walls." "That sounds nice," Marshall said. "And tell me, Emma, what do you like to do at home?" "I like to draw," Emma said, gaining slightly more confidence as the questions remained gentle and non-threatening. "And read books. Mommy reads to me at bedtime." Marshall allowed Emma to continue talking about her daily routines, her school, her friends, her activities. He was establishing a picture of a stable, nurturing home environment. Emma described her mornings with her mother, her school day, her afternoons where would pick her up and they would sometimes go to the park or have snacks together. Then gradually, Marshall began to shift the nature of his questions. "Emma, how often do you see your daddy?" "I see Daddy on weekends," Emma said, "every other weekend, and he calls me at night sometimes." "How do you feel about seeing your daddy?" Marshall asked gently, but the question had changed the trajectory of the conversation. Emma hesitated, and Judge noticed immediately. The child was aware that her answer mattered in a way that discussing her purple bedroom walls did not. She glanced at her mother again, and what passed between them, though wordless, was profoundly significant to every observant person in the courtroom. "I like seeing Daddy," Emma said, but her voice had become smaller, more uncertain. But Mommy says that Daddy doesn't really have time for me because he works too much." "Has your daddy ever forgotten about you?" Marshall asked, his voice maintaining its gentle tone, but the question itself becoming leading and suggestive. Emma's small forehead creased as she thought. "Once," she said slowly. "He forgot my birthday, but he said he was sorry. He gave me a big party the next weekend." "But he did forget," Marshall pressed gently. "Your birthday is an important day, isn't it? How did that make you feel?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Sad," she whispered. "But Daddy said he was really sorry. He felt really bad about it." Judge leaned forward slightly, and Marshall noticed the judge's body language shift. He decided to redirect. "Emma, you love your mommy, don't you?" "Yes," Emma said immediately, emphatically. "And you want to stay with your mommy?" This was the crucial question, the one Emma's mother had coached her extensively to answer in a particular way. Emma opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her small hands were trembling slightly. I love Mommy," Emma said carefully, as though she was reading from a script she'd memorized. "And I want to stay with Mommy." But then something shifted in Emma's face. A struggle appeared to cross it, and her lower lip began to quiver. Marshall, sensing the answer he wanted, sat down. Then it was David's attorney's turn. Sandra approached the witness stand with a different demeanor than Marshall had employed. She was respectful but more direct, and she seemed genuinely interested in Emma's rather than just establishing facts for her narrative. "Emma, I'm Sandra and I work with your father," Sandra said. "I have some more questions for you, but they're important, okay?" Emma nodded nervously. "When you're at your dad's house, what do you do together?" Sandra asked. Emma brightened slightly. "We cook pancakes on Saturday mornings. Daddy lets me crack the eggs, even though sometimes I get shells in them, and we watch movies together, and he helps me with my homework, and we go to the park." "Does your daddy listen to you?" Sandra asked. "Yes," Emma said. "He listens really good. He asks me about my day at school and what I learned." "Emma, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer very honestly, okay? There's no wrong answer." Sandra's voice had become gentler. "When you think about feeling safe and loved, who makes you feel that way?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. This was an unusual question for a child to be asked directly in court, but Sandra was opening a door to Emma's authentic emotional reality, rather than the narrative her mother had coached her to present. Emma's eyes filled with tears immediately. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness stand tightly. She looked at her mother, and Judge saw the child's internal conflict play out across her small face. It was as if Emma was wrestling with an impossible question that had been framed as having a politically correct answer, when Emma's heart wanted to give a different one. "Both," Emma whispered. "I love both Mommy and Daddy." "But if you had to choose one," Sandra pressed gently, "if you had to think about who makes you feel safest and most secure, who would that be?" "I don't want to choose." Emma's voice rose with distress and tears began streaming down her face. "I love them both. I don't want to make Daddy sad or Mommy sad." The courtroom had become completely silent. No one moved. Emma was openly crying now, the emotional truth that had been suppressed and coached and manipulated finally breaking through. "I'm scared all the time," Emma continued, her words tumbling out between sobs. "Because Mommy cries and says Daddy doesn't love me, but I know that's not true because Daddy calls me every night and he remembers things I like, and he's nice to me, and Mommy says mean things about him, and I don't want to hurt her feelings, but I don't want to hurt Daddy's feelings either." The testimony had devolved into raw, authentic emotion. the kind of truthful expression that no lawyer could have choreographed or controlled. Looked stricken. David's face had crumpled with barely suppressed emotion. Judge's stern expression had shifted into something more complex, something that looked like pain and recognition combined. Marshall Finch stood to object, but Judge raised a hand, silencing him. "The child may continue," the judge said quietly. But Emma had already said what needed to be said. The careful narrative that had constructed had shattered like glass, revealing the traumatized, conflicted child beneath. A child who was suffering not from her father's negligence, but from her mother's desperation and the impossible position she'd been placed in. The courtroom had witnessed genuine emotional truth, and no lawyer's argument could compete with that authenticity. The courtroom was still reeling from Emma's emotional breakdown when Judge called for a brief recess. The sudden cessation of proceedings left everyone in a state of confused suspension, uncertain whether this was a strategic pause or a genuine break in the proceedings. Marshall Finch was conferring urgently with, clearly disturbed by how dramatically Emma's testimony had deviated from their carefully prepared narrative. David sat quietly, visibly moved by his daughter's raw pain, his attorney Sandra placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Judge retreated to his chambers, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes with the heel of his palm. He felt the weight of what he'd just witnessed, not the legal arguments, but the authentic suffering of a child caught between two people she loved. In his 28 years on the bench, he'd learned to recognize when something significant had shifted in a case, and he felt that shift now. Emma's breakdown had been honest, devastating, and impossible to dismiss as the coached response of a child too young to understand the implications of her words. In the hallway outside the courtroom, however, something entirely different was being set into motion. Emma's therapist, Doctor, had been observing the proceedings from the gallery, her face carefully neutral as she watched the testimony unfold. Doctor was a clinical psychologist specializing in child trauma, and she had worked extensively with Emma over the past 8 months in a therapeutic program that extended far beyond traditional talk therapy. Doctor approached Sandra during the recess, her expression serious and purposeful. "I need to speak with you about something," Doctor said quietly. "I have documentation of therapeutic work that directly addresses what we just witnessed in that courtroom. It's relevant to Emma's case, and I believe the court should hear about it." Sandra's eyes widened with interest. This was the first mention of any therapeutic program beyond the standard psychological evaluation that had been conducted months earlier. "What kind of therapeutic work?" Sandra asked carefully. "Service animal therapy," Doctor explained. "Specifically, an intensive 8-month program involving a trained K-9 officer who has been reassigned to therapeutic work. The dog's name is Ranger, and he's been working directly with Emma to help her process emotional trauma and anxiety related to the custody situation." Sandra processed this information carefully. "Is this in any of the discovery documents, any court filings?" "No," Doctor admitted. "The program began after the initial psychological evaluation, and frankly, I kept it confidential to protect Emma from either parent weaponizing it against her in court. Would have tried to use it as evidence of mental instability, and David might have felt pressured to provide it prematurely before Emma had fully benefited from the work." "This could be significant," Sandra said, already thinking through the legal and therapeutic implications. "But introducing it now, without prior notice to the other side, could be problematic from a procedural standpoint. However, if Judge allows it," she trailed off, recognizing the unprecedented nature of what was being proposed. Doctor nodded. "I understand the complications, but what you witnessed in there, that was Emma's authentic emotional truth breaking through her mother's conditioning. Ranger has been instrumental in helping her access that truth. His presence might actually help the court understand the depth of Emma's emotional situation." Back in Judge's chambers, a similar conversation was occurring. Emma's therapist had requested a private meeting with the judge, an unusual request that had initially been by the judge's clerk. However, Judge, still troubled by what he'd witnessed, had agreed to a brief meeting. Doctor sat across from the judge, her professional credentials and demeanor lending weight to her words. "Your Honor, what occurred in that courtroom represents genuine psychological distress," Doctor explained. "Emma has been subjected to parental alienation tactics by her mother, which has created significant anxiety and emotional conflict. However, over the past 8 months, she's been participating in a therapeutic program that has been instrumental in helping her develop coping mechanisms and access her authentic emotional needs." Judge listened intently, his judicial demeanor unchanged, though Doctor could see interest in his pale eyes. "What kind of program?" he asked. "Service animal therapy, specifically involving a trained K-9 officer named Ranger," Doctor explained. "The dog has been trained to recognize and respond to emotional distress, and his presence has allowed Emma to express feelings she's been suppressing or been coached to suppress. I believe that allowing Ranger to be present in the courtroom during Emma's testimony could provide the court with crucial information about her authentic emotional state." "That's highly irregular," Judge said carefully, "and potentially problematic from a legal procedural standpoint. However," he paused, considering the weight of his own judicial experience and what his instincts were telling him about this case. "I've been on the bench for a long time, Doctor. I've learned to recognize when something significant is missing from a case. Something was missing here. Perhaps this is it." He leaned back in his chair, making a decision that he recognized would be unconventional, but that his judicial experience suggested might be necessary. "I'm going to allow this. However, it will need to be presented to both attorneys, and will need to establish a proper foundation for the dog's presence and behavior." When the recess ended and the courtroom reconvened, Judge made an announcement that sent ripples of confusion through the gallery. "The court has been made aware of a therapeutic program that may be relevant to these proceedings. All parties will reconvene in 15 minutes, and there will be a brief interruption to allow for the presentation of new evidence." The next 15 minutes were chaotic. Marshal Finch erupted in objections, demanding to know what this surprise evidence was and arguing vehemently that it violated proper discovery procedures. Looked panicked, whispering urgently to her attorney. David and Sandra exchanged glances of cautious optimism, though Sandra was equally confused about what was about to be introduced. The gallery buzzed with confused speculation. Law students frantically took notes, sensing that they were witnessing something unusual. Court observers leaned toward each other, whispering theories about what the interruption could mean. Emma sat quietly in her chair, swinging her legs slightly, emotionally exhausted from her testimony. She had no idea what was about to happen. Then the courtroom doors opened. An officer entered, leading Ranger on a handler's lead. The German Shepherd was a magnificent animal, large, powerfully built, with alert eyes and a bearing that suggested both strength and training. The dog moved with the controlled grace of a professional working animal, his attention focused and disciplined. The courtroom erupted in gasps and surprised exclamations. Judge gavelled for order, silencing the gallery. Marshal Finch stood, launching into loud objections about procedure and proper notification. But Judge raised his hand authoritatively, commanding silence. "The dog will remain," Judge said firmly. "Officer, you may position the dog near the witness chair. Doctor, you may explain the significance of this animal's presence and training." As officer led Ranger to a position near the witness stand, something extraordinary happened. Emma's entire demeanor shifted. Her exhaustion seemed to lift slightly, and for the first time since the proceedings had begun, a genuine smile appeared on her small face. She reached out a hand tentatively toward Ranger, who maintained his professional composure but whose tail wagged slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement. The courtroom fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. the silence of people recognizing that they were witnessing something significant and deeply moving. Judge looked at Emma, then at Ranger, then at Doctor, and something in his expression suggested that he understood they were about to embark on an unprecedented journey through this custody case. The introduction of this magnificent animal had fundamentally altered the nature of the proceedings, and no one in the courtroom, except perhaps Doctor, fully understood why or what would come next. The courtroom had settled into a tense quiet, the kind of silence that precedes something momentous. Officer stood with Ranger positioned several feet from the witness stand, maintaining professional distance while keeping the dog within Emma's line of sight. Judge gazed down from his elevated position with an expression that was difficult to read, a mixture of judicial skepticism and curious anticipation. Marshal Finch had reluctantly seated himself, though his jaw was clenched tightly and his fingers drummed irritably on the legal pad before him. Doctor stood to address the court, and her professional composure was evident in every gesture and word choice. Your Honor, over the past 8 months, I have been working with Emma Richardson in a therapeutic program that incorporates service-animal interaction as a primary healing modality. Ranger is a fully certified service animal who underwent extensive training with the State Police K-9 unit before being reassigned to therapeutic work following a work-related injury that prevented him from continuing active duty. What was the nature of this injury? Judge asked, his tone suggesting that he wanted to understand the legitimacy of the dog's reassignment. A ligament injury to his rear leg, Doctor explained. The injury healed well, but given the stress that active police work places on the musculoskeletal system, the determination was made that therapeutic work would be more appropriate for the dog's long-term health, and Ranger has been retraining specifically for emotional support and trauma-informed therapy work. Sandra, who had been briefed by Doctor during the recess, began asking clarifying questions designed to establish the legitimacy and scientific foundation of the program. Doctor, what is the theoretical basis for service animal therapy in cases of childhood emotional trauma? Research over the past 2 decades has established that service animals can provide measurable therapeutic benefits through several mechanisms, Doctor explained. Animals provide non-judgmental presence, which is particularly valuable for traumatized children. They can help regulate the nervous system through physical touch and proximity. Additionally, animals can serve as what we call emotional mirrors. They respond authentically to emotional states without the social filtering that humans employ. For children who have been conditioned or coached to suppress authentic emotions, an animal's genuine response can help break through that conditioning. Marshal Finch stood, his objection ready. Your Honor, this testimony is highly speculative and not based on admissible evidence. I move to exclude. Overruled, Judge said firmly. Continue, Doctor. Specifically with Emma, Doctor continued, I observed that traditional talk therapy was limited in effectiveness because she had been conditioned to provide responses that pleased her mother rather than accessing her authentic emotional state. Ranger's presence changed that dynamic. Emma began to express genuine feelings in his presence that she had been suppressing in other contexts. Judge leaned forward slightly. You're suggesting that this dog can help us access the child's authentic emotional state. I'm not suggesting it, Your Honor, Doctor said with quiet confidence. I'm stating it based on 8 months of documented therapeutic work. The question I'd like to put before the court now is whether Emma would be willing to answer a crucial question about her authentic emotional needs while Ranger is present. Judge looked at Emma, who had been sitting quietly, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Ranger. Miss Richardson, would you be willing to answer some additional questions with Ranger nearby? Emma nodded, a small gesture but one that carried weight in the courtroom. Doctor approached the witness stand and positioned herself slightly to the side, addressing Emma with the careful gentleness that had characterized their therapeutic relationship. Emma, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. There's no right or wrong answer. I just want to know what you truly feel. Okay. Emma nodded, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. Emma, when you think about feeling safe and loved, when you think about the people in your life who make you feel secure and protected, who do you think of? Doctor asked carefully. The courtroom held its collective breath. This was the moment that would define the proceedings. Every person in the courtroom understood the significance of the question, even if they didn't fully comprehend the therapeutic methodology that had led to this moment. Emma's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. She looked toward her mother, and Judge saw the terrible internal conflict play out across the child's small face. Shook her head slightly, a gesture that might have meant anything: encouragement, warning, plea. Emma's lips trembled. I don't know, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, you do, Doctor said gently but firmly. Deep inside, Emma, in the part of you that's most honest and true, you know, who makes you feel safe. Emma turned her head slowly toward her father. Their eyes met, and in that moment, years of love and connection seemed to pass between them silently. Emma's small hand rose, trembling visibly, and she pointed directly at David Richardson. Daddy, she said, the word escaping as a whisper-thin sound but carrying the weight of absolute truth. Daddy makes me feel safe. The courtroom erupted, not in applause or noise, but in an almost audible gasp, as though everyone had been holding their breath and suddenly released it simultaneously. And then something extraordinary occurred that would remain embedded in the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Ranger, who had been standing calmly beside Officer, suddenly moved. The dog's entire demeanor shifted from professional stillness to purposeful action. Without any command, without any handler guidance, Ranger walked directly across the courtroom toward Emma. Officer made no move to restrain him. This response was clearly not unexpected, clearly part of the dog's training. Ranger approached the witness stand and, with a gentleness that belied his size and power, rested his massive head directly on Emma's lap. Not gently touching her knee or her hand, but actually resting his full head on her lap, as though offering the weight of his presence as validation and comfort. Emma's entire body shook as she wrapped her small arms around Ranger's head, and her suppressed sobs finally released. She cried, not the controlled tears of her earlier testimony, but deep, body-racking sobs that came from the absolute center of her being. She cried for all the months of confusion and pressure and impossible choices. She cried for the love she felt for both her parents and the impossible position she'd been placed in. She cried because, finally, someone, something, had recognized and validated her authentic emotional truth. Judge removed his glasses and turned away, ostensibly to look at some documents on his desk. But his shoulders moved slightly, and every observer in the courtroom understood that the judge was crying. Sat frozen, her face pale, her attorney's urgent whispers to her completely unheard. David's face was wet with tears, his hand covering his mouth as though to contain the overwhelming emotion he was experiencing. The courtroom remained completely silent except for Emma's sobs and the slight rustling sound of Ranger's tail wagging, a sound so subtle that only those close enough to the witness stand could hear it, but which seemed to fill the entire courtroom with its significance. Marshal Finch stood, his mouth opening as though to lodge an objection, but no words came. There was nothing to object to. This wasn't a legal argument or a procedural question. This was a human moment, a child's truth being validated by forces beyond manipulation, beyond coaching, beyond the control of any attorney or legal system. Doctor stood quietly, tears streaming down her own face, her professional composure giving way to the human recognition of witnessing genuine healing and truth in a space that was rarely designed to accommodate either. Officer maintained his position, but his eyes were also glistening with moisture. He had worked with Ranger for years and had seen the dog's therapeutic responses countless times, but the power of what was happening in this courtroom was still profound and moving. Minutes passed, though no one could have accurately counted how many. Finally, Emma's sobs began to subside slightly, though she kept her arms around Ranger's head, and the dog remained in his position, offering the physical comfort of his presence. Judge slowly replaced his glasses and looked down at the scene before him. This small girl and this large dog, connected in a moment of authentic emotional expression that transcended every legal argument, every procedural rule, every attorney's carefully constructed narrative. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was rough and thick with emotion. "We will take a recess. 1 hour. All counsel will remain available." He stood, and the bailiff called for everyone to rise, but Judge remained at his bench for several additional moments, simply looking at Emma and Ranger, as though committing the image to his memory as something that would define his understanding of justice for the remainder of his judicial career. Judge's private chambers were a sanctuary of quiet reflection, lined with law books, photographs from his family, and personal mementos accumulated over decades of judicial service. The judge sat behind his mahogany desk, his robe still on, his hands trembling slightly as he held a glass of water that his clerk had brought him without being asked. The clerk had recognized the signs. The judge needed a moment alone before conducting the private meeting he'd ordered. Had excused himself immediately after adjourning the courtroom, walking with measured dignity despite the emotional turmoil evident to anyone who understood how to read his body language. His clerk, who had worked with him for 15 years, simply nodded when he requested privacy and held all calls and visitors. She brought the water and then quietly. Judge sat in the silence of his chambers, removing his glasses and pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. In his 28 years on the bench, he had witnessed countless human moments, confessions, reconciliations, devastating family separations, triumphant vindications. He had prided himself on maintaining professional distance, on recognizing that his role was to interpret law rather than to serve as a repository for human emotion. Yet in that courtroom, something had shifted fundamentally in his understanding of what justice actually meant. He thought about the moment when Ranger had moved across the courtroom. Judge had presided over hundreds of custody cases, had listened to countless expert witnesses, had reviewed mountains of documentation about parental fitness and child. But nothing in his judicial training had prepared him for the moment when a dog had validated a child's emotional truth more effectively than any attorney's argument ever could. Stood and walked to the window of his chambers, looking out at the city streets below. He thought about his own children, now adults, and he wondered how different his relationship with them might have been if he'd been more attuned to their authentic emotional needs rather than the surface behaviors he'd observed. He thought about the countless cases where judges had to make decisions affecting children's lives based on competing narratives and limited information. Had he, in all his years, made the right decisions? Had his legal reasoning actually served the children involved, or had it merely served the law itself? He returned to his desk and pulled out a tissue, wiping his eyes with an action that he recognized would have been unthinkable for him just hours earlier. Judge, known for his stern demeanor and unwavering composure, was allowing himself to feel the profound weight of what he'd witnessed. A knock on his door interrupted his reflection, appeared with a file folder. "Doctor and officer are here for the private meeting, Your Honor. Both attorneys have also arrived as requested." Nodded, taking a moment to compose himself. He had requested this meeting, understanding that the courtroom had become a space too public for the kind of discussion that needed to occur. He needed to understand the therapeutic program more deeply, needed to establish a proper foundation for what had transpired, and needed to hear from Doctor about the substantive details of Emma's therapeutic work. When they entered his chambers, Doctor, Officer, Marshall Finch, Sandra, and notably, without their clients, Judge gestured for them to sit in the comfortable seating area rather than at his desk, a deliberate choice designed to create a less adversarial atmosphere than the formal desk arrangement would suggest. "What I witnessed in that courtroom was extraordinary," Judge began without preamble. "I need to understand it more fully. Doctor, I want to know about Emma's therapeutic journey with this dog. I want details, not the sanitized version for courtroom consumption, but the actual clinical observations and therapeutic breakthroughs you've documented." Doctor opened her file, which contained months of detailed therapeutic notes. "Your Honor, when Emma began therapy with me 8 months ago, she presented with severe anxiety, emotional suppression, and significant parental alienation symptoms. Her mother had been systematically undermining her relationship with her father, and Emma had internalized the message that loving her father equally meant betraying her mother. The psychological burden of that impossible position was manifesting in sleep disturbances, academic decline, and emotional regression. "What changed when Ranger was introduced?" Judge asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Everything," Doctor said simply. "Emma's psychological defenses are constructed around pleasing adults and anticipating their emotional needs. With humans, she could continue those defensive patterns, but with Ranger, she couldn't. The dog doesn't respond to coached answers or carefully constructed narratives. He responds to authentic emotional states. Within the first 2 weeks of working with Ranger, Emma began expressing genuine feelings she'd been suppressing." Judge nodded slowly. "Give me a specific example." Doctor consulted her notes. "During our 3rd session with Ranger, Emma was discussing her weekend with her father. She started with scripted positive comments, the kind she'd clearly been coached to deliver. But as Ranger moved closer to her and placed his head on her lap, Emma began crying and admitted that she feels scared and guilty when she's with her father because her mother told her that being happy with her father means she doesn't love her mother. She said she feels like she's betraying her mother by laughing or enjoying time with her dad." Marshall Finch shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Judge noticed the movement but continued his questioning. "Doctor, I need to ask this directly," Judge said. "Is it possible that Ranger's response in the courtroom today was conditioned specifically to validate Emma's statements about her father? Could the dog have been trained to respond in a particular way to influence the court proceedings?" "No, Your Honor," officer interjected. "I can address that directly. Ranger is trained to recognize genuine emotional distress and to provide comfort responses. His training is behavioral, not responsive to verbal content. He doesn't understand language well enough to know what Emma pointed at or what she said. He responded to her emotional state. She was experiencing profound emotional release, and Ranger's training is to provide comfort in those situations. His response would have been identical if she had pointed at her mother or at anyone else while in that emotional state." Judge turned to the 2 attorneys. "I need to know from a procedural standpoint whether the introduction of this evidence was appropriate. Mr. Finch, your objections are noted. However, I'm asking both of you now in chambers for your honest legal assessment. Regardless of the outcome you hoped for, was the introduction of this therapeutic evidence appropriate to a custody determination?" Sandra spoke first. "Your Honor, while I acknowledge that the timing was unconventional and the discovery of this program wasn't established through normal procedures, I believe the evidence is substantively appropriate. Custody determinations are supposed to be in the best interest of the child. Understanding the child's authentic emotional needs and psychological state seems directly relevant to that determination." Marshall Finch was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "From a purely legal standpoint, Your Honor, the introduction of evidence without proper notice to the opposing party is problematic. However," he paused, seeming to struggle with professional obligations versus personal honesty. "However, I cannot in good conscience argue that understanding the child's authentic emotional state is harmful to a custody proceeding. My objection stands on procedural grounds, but I acknowledge the substantive relevance of what occurred. Judge appreciated the attorney's honesty. I'm going to ask doctor to provide you both with complete documentation of Emma's therapeutic program, effective immediately. This ensures that the record is complete and that both parties have access to the same information going forward. Doctor nodded her agreement. Now, Judge continued, I have one more crucial question for you, doctor, based on your 8 months of work with Emma, based on your professional expertise and clinical observations. What do you believe is truly in Emma's best interest regarding custody? The room fell silent. This was a question that would directly influence the judge's decision, and everyone present understood the significance of the answer. Doctor took a breath. Your Honor, Emma needs stability, emotional safety, and protection from parental alienation. She needs a primary residence with her father, the parent who is currently positioned as the threat, but is actually the parent providing her with emotional safety and unconditional support. She also needs continued therapeutic work to heal from the alienation tactics she's experienced. And she needs a structured relationship with her mother that includes therapeutic support to help understand the harm that her behavior has caused. Judge closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of that clinical assessment. Thank you, doctor. I believe I now have the information I need to make an informed decision that serves Emma's actual best interests rather than her parents' competing narratives. As the meeting concluded and people began to file out of his chambers, Judge remained seated at his desk, feeling the weight of judicial responsibility more acutely than he had in decades. He understood that the ruling he was about to make would affect not just this one family, but potentially establish precedent for how courts should engage with evidence of a child's authentic emotional truth. The courtroom had been cleared and reorganized during the hour-long recess. Spectators and press had been held in the hallway, uncertain about what was occurring behind the judge's chamber's door. The gallery had filled again, though with more tension than before. People sensed that something significant was about to happen. David sat with Sandra, his hands folded on the table, his face a mask of controlled anxiety. Sat beside Marshall Finch, who was reviewing documents with the intensity of someone preparing for an appeal. Emma sat with a court-appointed guardian ad, a woman named Mrs. whose role was to represent Emma's interests independent of either parent. Mrs. had requested that Emma be allowed to remain in the courtroom for the ruling, arguing that a child of 7 deserved to hear the decision that would determine her life directly from the judge, rather than learning it secondhand from adults. Judge had agreed, though with the stipulation that Mrs. would be positioned to provide support if the child became emotionally distressed. Ranger had been removed from the courtroom and placed in a comfortable area outside with Officer, though the dog's impact remained palpable in the space, the invisible presence of authentic emotional truth that had altered everything. When Judge re-entered and the bailiff called for everyone to rise, the courtroom did so with unusual solemnity. The judge moved to his elevated chair with a bearing that suggested the gravity of what was about to occur. His face was composed, but those who knew how to read judicial expression could see the weight of careful deliberation etched into his features. "Please be seated," Judge commanded, and the courtroom settled into profound silence. This court has heard testimony, reviewed extensive documentation, and considered the best interests of the minor child, Emma Richardson, in this custody proceeding. Judge began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of judicial pronouncement. This case presented a particular challenge to the court because it required moving beyond traditional legal arguments to address the authentic emotional needs of the child involved. He paused, looking directly at Emma, who sat quietly beside Mrs. "Emma, I'm going to explain my decision in a way that I hope you'll understand, but I want you to know that everything I'm about to say is because the court cares about your happiness." Emma nodded, her small hands gripping Mrs.'s arm. The evidence presented to this court included testimony from both parents, documentation of each parent's involvement in your life, and expert testimony regarding your emotional and psychological needs. Judge continued. Additionally, this court was provided with direct evidence of your authentic emotional state through a therapeutic program that helped you express your true feelings. All of this evidence points to the same conclusion: that you need a stable, secure environment where you can feel protected and loved without guilt or anxiety about betraying your other parent. Judge removed his glasses briefly, a gesture that suggested the personal nature of what he was about to say. After careful consideration of all evidence, and in accordance with what this court believes to be in your best interest, I am issuing the following custody order. The courtroom held its collective breath. Primary physical custody of Emma Richardson is awarded to her father, David Richardson. Emma will reside with her father as her primary residence, with her education, health care, and major decisions regarding her welfare to be determined primarily by her father in consultation with appropriate professionals, including her therapist. Made an audible sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Marshall Finch immediately placed a restraining hand on her arm, his face darkening with anger at the unfavorable ruling. However, Judge continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure that his complete ruling was heard and understood, this is not a ruling that removes Richardson from Emma's life. Maternal visitation is established as follows. Emma will spend every other weekend with her mother, from Friday evening through Sunday evening. Additionally, Emma will spend one weekday evening per week with her mother. An extended vacation time will be negotiated and shared equally between both parents. He paused, allowing that information to settle. Importantly, both parents are ordered to participate in court-mandated co-parenting therapy. This therapy will focus on helping both parents understand the impact of their conflict on their daughter and developing healthier communication patterns that prioritize Emma's over their personal grievances. Judge turned his full attention toward Mrs. Richardson. I want to be direct with you. The evidence presented to this court and the testimony of a trained therapeutic professional indicates that Emma has experienced parental alienation, efforts to undermine her relationship with her father. This has caused her significant psychological distress. The purpose of the custody arrangement I'm establishing is to provide Emma with the stability and emotional security she needs, while maintaining a relationship with you that can be rehabilitated through therapeutic intervention. His face had gone pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked as though she might object or protest, but Sandra's professional demeanor and Judge's authoritative bearing prevented any outburst. Judge then addressed David. Mr. Richardson, you are now the primary custodial parent. This carries significant responsibility. I expect you to facilitate Emma's relationship with her mother, to encourage that relationship in a healthy way, and to prioritize your daughter's emotional needs above any residual hurt or anger toward her mother. Your role is to be the stable, secure parent that your daughter needs, and the evidence indicates that you already are. Continue that work. David nodded, visibly moved, his eyes glistening with tears of relief and vindication. Now, regarding the therapeutic component, Judge continued, Emma's work with doctor and with the service dog ranger is to continue as part of Emma's standard care. This is not optional. It is mandated by this court. Doctors' therapeutic services are to be funded equally by both parents, with the exception that if one parent's income is significantly limited, financial arrangements can be adjusted. However, the therapy itself is mandatory. He looked at Doctor, who sat in the gallery. Doctor, I want to commend you for your innovative and compassionate approach to this child's care. The introduction of service animal therapy into this case has fundamentally changed how I understand justice and child welfare. I would ask you to consider documenting this case for professional publication. The legal and therapeutic communities need to understand the power of what you've developed. Doctor nodded, tears visible in her own eyes. Judge then addressed the entire courtroom. I want to make a statement for the record regarding what occurred in these proceedings. For too long, family courts have relied on traditional adversarial processes that often fail to access a child's authentic emotional needs and truths. What we witness today, the response of a trained service animal to a child's genuine emotional state, suggests that there are methodologies available to us that can provide crucial information about children that traditional testimony often obscures. He paused, looking at the official court reporter to ensure that his words were being recorded. This court recognizes that the introduction of service animal therapy into custody proceedings is unconventional. However, I believe it serves justice. This ruling will include a detailed reference to the therapeutic program and its effectiveness, and I encourage other family courts to consider similar approaches when the evidence suggests they would serve a child's. Judge then looked directly at Emma. Emma, you were very brave in this courtroom today. You told the truth even though it was hard. That took courage. The decision I've made is because I listened to what you needed, not just what the adults wanted. You're going to live with your daddy, and you're going to get help from doctor and ranger to feel better about everything that's happened. Your mommy will still be your mommy, and you'll still see her, but you won't have to feel scared or confused anymore. That's what I hope will happen for you. Emma, who had been listening intently, nodded slowly. She looked toward her father, then toward her mother, then back at the judge. She didn't smile exactly, but her small face seemed to relax slightly, as though a burden she'd been carrying had been partly lifted. This court will remain available for any modifications or adjustments to this custody arrangement as Emma's needs evolve, Judge stated formally. However, I want to be clear that any such modifications should be based on Emma's genuine best interests, not on either parent's desire to maximize custody time or minimize financial obligations. He raised his gavel. This concludes these proceedings. The final order will be prepared and distributed to all parties within 10 days. Court is adjourned. As the bailiff called for everyone to rise, the courtroom did so slowly, people seeming to process the magnitude of what had just transpired. David stood and embraced Sandra, his face showing gratitude and relief. Sat in stunned silence, Marshall Finch already whispering words that might have been consolation or discussion of appeal options. But the most significant moment came when Emma, released from Mrs. Supervision, walked directly toward her father and wrapped her small arms around him. David knelt and held his daughter, his shoulders shaking with emotion as he finally got to hold his child without the cloud of legal uncertainty hanging over them. In that moment, the courtroom recognized that judgment had been rendered, not just in legal terms but in human terms. Justice, finally, had served the child. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in the courtroom when a service dog had validated a child's emotional truth and changed everything. The seasons had shifted from autumn to spring, and with them, the landscape of Emma Richardson's life had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. She now lived primarily with her father in a small house with a backyard where she could play freely, without the constant anxiety that had characterized her earlier years. The purple bedroom that she described in courtroom testimony had been replaced with a new room in her father's home, pale yellow walls with murals of trees and birds that she and David had painted together during a weekend project. Emma's grades had improved dramatically. What had been a pattern of C's and D's, grades reflecting her emotional distress and inability to concentrate, had transformed into consistent A's and B's. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had remarked to David that Emma seemed like a different child. "She's engaged, she's happy, she participates in class," Mrs. Henderson had written in a recent progress report. Whatever has changed in her home situation, it's had a profoundly positive effect. But the most significant indicator of Emma's healing wasn't reflected in academic metrics or behavioral observations. It was visible in her face. The perpetual tension that had characterized her expression, the slight furrow in her brow, the guardedness in her eyes, had largely dissipated. She smiled genuinely, laughed freely, and seemed to have recovered the natural lightness that should characterize a 7-year-old child. Emma's continued work with Doctor and Ranger had evolved into something even more remarkable than the initial therapeutic relationship. The twice-weekly sessions that had been mandated by the court had expanded into what Doctor called integration sessions, meetings designed not just to process trauma, but to actively build new neural pathways and emotional resilience. Ranger had become not just a therapeutic tool, but a genuine companion. Emma had even begun helping Officer with some of Ranger's training exercises, which had transformed her relationship with the dog from dependent to collaborative. Ranger has actually taught her something profound, Doctor had explained during a recent session with David, and a session that had become part of their court-mandated co-parenting therapy. He's taught her that expressing authentic emotion doesn't result in abandonment or punishment. He's taught her that her feelings matter and deserve to be acknowledged. Those are foundational lessons for her ongoing emotional development. His journey had been more complicated. The initial shock and devastation of losing primary custody had gradually transformed into something more productive, grudging acknowledgement that her own behavior had contributed to the situation, and a slow, difficult process of rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. The co-parenting therapy sessions had been painful and confrontational at first, but gradually had become spaces of genuine reflection and growth. Had even attended several of Emma's therapy sessions with Doctor's permission, a decision that had required her to hear directly from her daughter about the pain that her alienation tactics had caused. There had been tears from both and Emma, and difficult conversations about love, loyalty, and the impossible position had created for their daughter. Had begun to understand, perhaps for the first time, that her desperation to maintain primary custody had come from her own fears and insecurities rather than from Emma's actual best interests. "I was terrified of losing her," had confessed during one particularly vulnerable therapy session. "When your father and I separated, I felt like my entire identity was crumbling. Emma was my anchor, my proof that something I'd built still mattered. I used her to validate myself rather than supporting what she actually needed." Emma, hearing this, had wept, but different tears than the desperate sobs of the courtroom. These were tears of understanding, of compassion, of recognizing that her mother had been suffering too, even if that suffering didn't justify the harm caused. David had handled his new role as primary custodial parent with the grace and stability that had been evident throughout the proceedings. He'd maintained a commitment to facilitating Emma's relationship with her mother, encouraging her before each visitation and asking about her time without judgment. When Emma had complained about something said or did, David had helped her process those feelings therapeutically rather than using them as ammunition against her mother. Emma needs to know that it's okay to have a relationship with her mom, even if that relationship isn't perfect, David had explained to Doctor. "I don't want to repeat the pattern where she feels like she has to choose between her parents or feel guilty about loving someone." Judge's ruling had indeed become precedent-setting. Doctor, following the judge's recommendation, had published a detailed case study of Emma's therapeutic journey in a prominent family law and psychology journal. The article, titled "Service Animal Therapy as Evidence of Authentic Emotional State in Custody Proceedings," had generated significant professional interest. Legal scholars had begun citing judge reasoning, and several family courts in neighboring states had begun exploring how service animal therapy might be incorporated into custody evaluations. More significantly, David had established the Emma and Ranger Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing therapeutic service dog programs to children in custody disputes and other traumatic family situations. The foundation had begun with a single program at the local family court, but had expanded to 3 additional courts within the state. Dozens of children were now accessing the kind of therapeutic support that had transformed Emma's life. Officer had become a prominent advocate for expanding therapeutic animal programs in the justice system. He'd given presentations to bar associations, written op-ed pieces for legal publications, and worked with Doctor to develop standardized training protocols for service dogs being transitioned into therapeutic work. Ranger had become something of a local celebrity, recognized in the community as the dog whose extraordinary response had changed the trajectory of one child's life and influenced how family courts across the state approached custody determinations. Judge had continued to preside over family court cases, but with a fundamentally changed approach. He'd begun mandating therapeutic evaluations in cases where he suspected parental alienation or coaching of children. He'd become more willing to consider unconventional evidence and approaches if they seemed likely to illuminate a child's authentic emotional state. He'd also become an advocate within the judicial community for what he called child-centered justice, an approach that prioritized children's actual over procedural formalities or parental preferences. 1 year after the court ruling, a follow-up appointment had been scheduled with Doctor. As Emma sat with her therapist and Ranger, the changes were unmistakable. Emma had gained confidence, developed resilience, and built genuine emotional competence. She spoke articulately about her feelings, could identify her emotional states, and had developed healthy coping mechanisms for managing stress and anxiety. "How are things with your mom?" Doctor asked during their session. "Better," Emma said thoughtfully. "Mom's still sad sometimes, but she's not angry at Daddy anymore. We do stuff together now and it's nice. She even came to my school play and didn't cry this time." "That's wonderful progress," Doctor said. "And how do you feel about living with your dad?" "I feel safe," Emma said simply. "I feel like I can just be myself without worrying that someone's going to be sad or mad at me, and Ranger helps me when I get worried about stuff." As if on cue, Ranger rested his head on Emma's lap, that same gesture that had moved an entire courtroom to tears. But now, instead of being a moment of desperate validation, it was simply a gesture of companionship and comfort in a child's ongoing journey of healing. The case of Richardson v. Richardson had ultimately been about far more than custody percentages and visitation schedules. It had been about a legal system's capacity to evolve beyond traditional approaches when faced with compelling evidence of human truth. It had been about the power of innovation and compassion in therapeutic work. It had been about a dog's extraordinary ability to cut through adult deception and manipulation to reveal a child's authentic needs. And most importantly, it had been about one small girl's journey from trauma and confusion to security and wholeness. Judge sometimes reflected on that day in the courtroom when Ranger had crossed the room and placed his head on Emma's lap. He wondered if he'd ever fully return to the stern, emotionally distant judge he'd been before that moment. He doubted it. That moment had fundamentally altered his understanding of what justice meant, and he carried that altered understanding into every custody case he presided over from that day forward. Emma Richardson, now 8 years old, continued to thrive. She had a stable home, loving relationships with both parents, meaningful therapeutic support, and a remarkable dog who had taught her that her voice mattered and that her truth deserved to be heard. The impossible position she'd been placed in as a pawn in her parents' battle had been transformed into a platform for genuine healing, not just for her, but for countless other children who would now have access to the kind of therapeutic support that had changed her life. The little girl who had pointed toward her father in a courtroom and been validated by a service dog had become, inadvertently, a catalyst for systemic change in how the family court system approached child welfare and justice.